Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Jennifer Nakamura had seen men die in 6 different countries, but she'd never seen fear photographed like this. Brandon Mitchell's camera, found at mile marker 12 with battery still warm, held 247 images. The last one showed something standing behind him in the frame's reflection, something with legs bent wrong and eyes that caught the flash like an animal's, except animals didn't smile. She'd been with the National Park Service for 8 years now. Great Smoky Mountains her assignment since leaving the Army in 2007. Before that, 3 tours through Afghanistan's Korangal Valley, where she'd earned her Ranger tab and a reputation for staying calm when things turned to shit. She'd pulled wounded men through Taliban fire, cleared buildings in Kandahar, survived an IED that killed 2 friends. Nothing in those mountains had prepared her for this. The camera sat on her desk in the ranger station at Clingman's Dome, its memory card extracted, images cycling on her laptop screen. Brandon Mitchell, 31 wildlife photographer from Asheville, had checked in at the Alum Cave trailhead 3 days ago. Solo hike planning to shoot black bears emerging from winter dens, expected return Monday evening, when his girlfriend called Tuesday morning, frantic because he'd missed their anniversary dinner and wasn't answering his satellite phone. Jennifer had started standard search protocols. They'd found the camera first. No backpack, no gear, just the Nikon D810 lying in moss 20 feet off the trail, lens cap still on, as if someone had set it down carefully and walked away. Except Brandon Mitchell hadn't walked anywhere. His boot prints stopped abruptly 30 yards further up the path, stopped mid-stride in soft mud, right foot forward, as if he'd simply ceased to exist between steps. Jennifer clicked through the photos again. Early morning shots of mist through old-growth hemlock. A barred owl on a branch. Rhododendron buds just beginning to open. Then the sequence that made her jaw clench. Frame 245. Brandon grinning at the camera, self-timer shot, mountains blue and infinite behind him. Frame 246. Same angle, same smile. But now, if you looked at the reflection in his sunglasses, something stood in the trees behind the camera position. Frame 247. The final image, taken 17 seconds later according to the metadata. The camera had jerked, the shot blurred, capturing only darkness and what might have been fingers. Too long, too many joints, reaching into the frame. Anything? She looked up. Tom Voigt, her supervisor, stood in the doorway with coffee that smelled like it had been on the burner since morning. He was 56, 28 years with the service, and had the weathered patience of someone who'd seen enough lost hikers to know most situations resolve themselves within 48 hours. "His tracks end," Jennifer said. "Just stop. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. It's like he evaporated." Tom studied the laptop screen. "Weather moving in tonight? Heavy stuff. We'll need to pull the search team by 1600 if we want them off the mountain safely. I'm going back out. Jen, we've had 12 people up there since dawn. Covered a 4-mile radius from his last known position. Dogs hit nothing. Helicopter with thermal imaging found nothing. It's going to be dark in 3 hours and that front's bringing freezing rain." She turned the laptop toward him. "Look at the reflection. In his glasses. Frame 246. Tom leaned closer, squinting. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "Could be another hiker. Tree shadow. Pareidolia. Seeing faces in random patterns." "His tracks stopped, Tom. Mid-stride. And this," she pointed at the screen. "This was taken seconds before he vanished. You're talking like something supernatural happened. I'm talking like something happened that doesn't make sense with the evidence. That's what I'm trained to do. Find what doesn't make sense and figure it out." Tom sighed, the sound of a man who'd had this argument before with younger rangers who still believed every mystery had a solution. "You've got until dark. Take the radio, check in every 30 minutes. If that freezing rain starts, you get off the mountain. That's an order." Jennifer grabbed her pack, already loaded with water, first aid, headlamp, emergency shelter, flares, and headed for her truck. The Klingman's Dome parking lot was empty except for maintenance vehicles. Late March, shoulder season. Most tourists not arriving until April when the wildflowers started. The isolation was why Brandon had come. Fewer people, better wildlife opportunities. She took the trail at a fast walk, eating distance with the efficient stride she'd learned carrying 80 pounds of gear through Hindu Kush. The forest pressed close here, old trees with trunks wider than her truck, their canopy filtering afternoon light into a green underwater dimness. Rhododendron thickets formed impenetrable walls on either side of the path. The silence felt wrong. No birds, no squirrel chatter, just her boots on dirt and the whisper of wind through branches. Mile marker 12 appeared, small brown sign nearly hidden by ferns. She found the spot where they'd recovered the camera, marked now with orange flagging tape. Knelt in the moss, studied the ground. The forest floor told stories if you knew how to read it. Compressed leaves, disturbed soil, broken twigs. Jennifer had tracked insurgents through Afghan villages, followed signs so subtle it was almost instinct. This should be easy, but there was nothing. The camera's impression in the moss, yes. Brandon's boot prints approaching from downslope, clear in mud near a seasonal seep. Then the prints leading upward, stride normal, weight distribution even, until they just ended. Both feet visible in the mud, toe of the right boot showing he'd been mid-step, leaning forward with momentum. And then nothing. No other tracks. No disturbance in the leaf litter beyond. No branches broken at head height. Nothing dragged. Nothing dropped. She moved in a spiral pattern expanding outward, eyes scanning for anything out of place. Found a scuff mark on a tree trunk, bark scraped away at roughly 7 feet up. Climbed the slope to examine it closer. The mark was fresh, pale wood exposed, but the damage didn't match anything logical. Not deer antler rub, not bear claw. It looked almost like something with fingers had grabbed the tree, fingernails gouging deep. A smell hit her then, thick, organic, wrong. Like a petting zoo in summer heat, but more pungent. Goat, she thought, though that made no sense. No domestic animals allowed in the park, no wild goats in these mountains. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, making her eyes water. Jennifer pulled out her radio. Base, this is Nakamura, at the recovery site. Something's off here. Static, then Tom's voice. Define off. Can't explain it. Just wrong. The tracks, the way they end, these marks on the trees, and there's a smell like... The radio crackled. Again, you're... More static. Braking. She checked the display. Full battery, supposedly clear line of sight to the repeater tower 3 miles north. Base, do you copy? Nothing but white noise. Jennifer tried again, adjusting frequency, but got only static on every channel. She checked her cell phone, knowing it was pointless at this elevation. No signal as expected. The park's satellite phone was back in her truck. Standard protocol said return to base when comms failed, but standard protocol assumed normal situations. Movement in her peripheral vision. She turned fast, hand instinctively moving to where her sidearm would have been if this was Afghanistan and not Tennessee. But rangers didn't carry guns, just bear spray and harsh language. The forest looked empty, just trees and shadows and that green twilight gloom. Except one shadow seemed darker than the others, denser. Between 2 large oaks about 40 yards upslope, a vertical darkness that didn't quite match the afternoon light. She stared at it, trying to resolve the shape. It shifted slightly, or maybe it was just wind-moving branches creating the illusion of movement. Hello? Her voice came out harder than intended, the command tone from the army. This is Park Service. If someone's there, identify yourself. The shadow didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, impossible to focus on directly, like trying to look at something in extreme peripheral vision. Jennifer started toward it, pulling her mag light from her belt. 50 feet of distance. 40. The smell intensified, making her gag. 30 feet. She could see the shadow more clearly now, could see it was taller than a person should be, maybe 7 feet, with proportions that seemed wrong. The legs appeared too long, bent at odd angles, and was that? It moved. Fast. Faster than anything that size should move through dense forest. One moment standing between the oaks, the next vanishing into the rhododendron with a sound like breaking branches, and something that might have been breathing but was too deep, too resonant, to come from human lungs. She ran after it without thinking. Pure instinct from 100 night patrols where hesitation meant ambush. Crashed through the rhododendron, branches whipping her face, thorns catching her jacket. Broke through into a small clearing she hadn't known existed, breathing hard. Empty. The clearing was empty. Just a circle of bare earth about 20 feet across, surrounded by the dense thicket. No tracks in the dirt. No broken branches showing where something had exited. The smell lingered, making her sinuses burn. Jennifer spun slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. But she felt watched. The same feeling she'd had on patrol in Kandahar, that prickling certainty that eyes were on you, that someone was lining up a shot. She'd learned to trust that feeling. It had kept her alive. On the ground near the clearing center, something caught the light. She approached carefully, maglite beam focused. A camera lens cap, Nikon brand. She picked it up, turned it over. On the inside, written in silver Sharpie, BM, Brandon Mitchell's initials. This was his lens cap, the one that had been on his camera when they found it. But the camera had been downslope. She'd just come uphill. This clearing was at least 200 yards from where they'd recovered the Nikon. How had the lens cap gotten here? Unless Brandon had been here. Unless whatever took him had brought him here. Jennifer swept the maglite around the clearing's perimeter, looking for anything else. Found marks in the dirt that made her stomach clench. They looked like footprints, but wrong. Human-sized, yes. But the shape was off. The toes too long, extending forward in a way that suggested hooves or claws. The stride was impossibly wide, at least 6 feet between prints, and they circled the clearing repeatedly, overlapping, as if something had walked around and around this space, pacing, waiting. She photographed everything with her phone, even though the images would be useless without cell signal to transmit them. Then she noticed the trees. All around the clearing's edge, at about chest height, the bark had been marked. Not carved, marked, long scratches deep, running vertically down the trunks. Some were recent, sap still sticky, others older, weathered gray, and on one particular oak, something else. Jennifer moved closer, maglite beam steady despite the tremor in her hand. Symbols, crude but deliberate, cut into the bark with something sharp. Not English letters, not any alphabet she recognized, but they formed patterns that seemed almost intentional, like language or warning, or claim. A stick snapped behind her. She whirled, fumbling for the bear spray. The clearing remained empty, but now she heard it, breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from everywhere at once, reverberating through the trees like a bass note that she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears. And underneath it, something that might have been words, not English, not any language she'd heard in Afghanistan or anywhere else, just sounds that formed patterns, repeated phrases that made her skull ache. "Brandon?" She called it out, hating the desperation in her voice. "Brandon Mitchell, if you can hear me, I'm here to help. I'm with Park Service." The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, Jennifer realized the forest had gone completely dead. No wind, no insects, no distant bird calls. Just absolute stillness, like the world was holding its breath. Then something laughed. Not human laughter. The sound came from downslope, deep and resonant, almost a bleat but with amusement in it, intelligence behind it. It lasted 3 seconds and ended abruptly, leaving only echoes that seemed to come from wrong directions, bouncing off trees in ways that shouldn't be possible. Jennifer ran. Not out of fear. She'd been scared before, knew how to function through fear, but out of tactical necessity. You didn't stay in the kill zone when you didn't understand the terrain or the enemy. You displaced, found cover, reassessed. She crashed back through the rhododendron branches tearing at her clothes and hit the main trail at a sprint. Her truck was 3 miles downslope. She could make that in 30 minutes at this pace. Get to the satellite phone, call in her position, request backup with actual weapons. Behind her, something kept pace. She could hear it moving through the forest parallel to the trail, never quite visible through the trees, but close enough that she caught glimpses of shadow, flashes of movement. It was playing with her. That realization hit with crystal clarity. Whatever this was, it was faster than her. Could catch her any time it wanted, but was choosing to follow, to let the fear build. The trail markers seemed wrong. She should have hit mile marker 11 by now, but the next sign said marker 13. That wasn't possible. She'd been running downslope heading toward the trailhead, but somehow she'd gone uphill. The trail didn't loop here. It was a straight shot down the mountain. Jennifer stopped, breathing hard, trying to orient herself. Pulled out her compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle, cycling through all points like it couldn't find north. She tapped it. The needle didn't change, just kept that slow rotation. A voice called from the trees to her left. "Help!" Man's voice. Young, desperate. "Help me, please, I'm hurt." Brandon Mitchell's voice. She'd heard it on the voicemail his girlfriend played during the initial interview. Same Carolina accent, same tenor. "Brandon?" She moved toward the voice, hand on her bear spray. "Keep talking, I'm coming to you." "Here," the voice called. "I fell. Can't move my leg." She pushed through the underbrush following the voice and emerged on what should have been a game trail, but looked like nothing she'd seen before. The trees here grew in a perfect circle, their trunks forming an unbroken ring about 30 feet across. Inside the circle, the ground was bare earth, packed hard, and in the center, not Brandon. The thing stood upright on legs that bent backward at the knee like a goat's, ending in hooves that had gouged the packed earth. Its torso was human in proportion, but covered in coarse dark hair. The arms hung too long, hands reaching nearly to the ground, fingers tipped with yellowed nails that looked more like claws. And the head. Jennifer had seen insurgents killed by close-range rifle fire, had seen bodies after IED explosions, had watched medics try to reassemble the wounded. But nothing in those memories compared to this. The head was wrong in every dimension. Too wide, too narrow, covered in that same coarse hair but with patches of skin showing through, gray and mottled. The eyes were yellow, pupils horizontal slits like a goat's, but set in a face that was almost human. Almost. The nose was broad and flat, nostrils flaring, and the mouth, too wide, stretching nearly ear to ear when it smiled, revealing teeth that were flat and grinding in the back, but sharp in the front, designed for a diet that included meat. It spoke in Brandon's voice. "Thank you for coming. I was so scared." Then it laughed, that same bleating sound she'd heard before, and she realized with horror that it had been calling her here, using the photographer's voice, luring her into this circle of trees. Jennifer raised the bear spray, popped the safety. "Where is he? What did you do with Brandon Mitchell?" The creature tilted its head, and its expression shifted into something that might have been curiosity. When it spoke again, the voice was different, older, female, with a mountain accent. "You shouldn't be here after dark, young lady. Things walk these woods that don't take kindly to strangers." Her grandmother's voice. Her grandmother who'd died in 2003, who'd grown up in these mountains before moving to Knoxville. The creature smiled wider, showing more of those terrible teeth. Or maybe... A third voice now, male, drill sergeant Bark. "Get your head down, Nakamura. Incoming." Her old platoon sergeant, the man who'd trained her, who'd been killed by sniper fire in Helmand province. Jennifer's hand shook. The bear spray wouldn't work. She knew that suddenly, completely. This wasn't a bear. Whatever it was using her own memories against her, pulling voices from her past, and the violation of that felt worse than any physical threat. "What are you?" She forced the words out steady, military calm, refusing to show fear. The creature dropped to all fours, and the movement was horribly fluid, joints bending in ways that made her vision blur trying to follow. It circled her, staying just outside the bear spray's range. hooves clicking on packed earth. It spoke in its own voice finally, deep, resonant, ancient. I am what's always been here. Before your trails, before your names for these mountains, before your kind decided this land was yours to walk freely. I am the warning your ancestors knew to heed. The reason they told stories about staying on the path, about not going into the deep woods after dusk, about respecting the boundaries between your world and ours. Where's Brandon? The photographer? The creature paused its circling. He saw me. Actually saw me, not just glimpses in shadow. He tried to capture me in his machine to take my image back to your world as proof. That could not be allowed. What did you do to him? What is done to all who see too clearly? What will be done to you? It rose on its hind legs again, towering over her. But you are different. You have killed. You have walked in death's shadow and returned. You interest me, so I will give you a choice. Jennifer kept the bear spray aimed at its center mass, knowing it was pointless. What choice? Leave now. Walk back down this mountain and never return to these trails. Tell your superiors you found nothing, that the photographer vanished as men sometimes do in wild places. Forget what you've seen. Go back to your small human life. The creature leaned forward and she could smell its breath, hot and rank and ancient. Or stay. Try to find him. Try to stop me. But know that if you stay, if you keep searching, you will learn things that will hollow you out from inside. You will see what I've done, what I am, and you will never sleep peacefully again. I'm not leaving without Brandon Mitchell. Dead or alive, his family deserves to know what happened. The creature studied her for a long moment. Then it laughed, that terrible bleating sound. Your courage is admirable and foolish. Very well, Ranger, I accept your choice. It dropped to all fours again and bounded away, impossibly fast, disappearing into the trees. Jennifer stood alone in the circle, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Her training said this wasn't real, couldn't be real. But her eyes had seen it. Her ears had heard it. The smell still lingered in the air. She checked her compass. The needle had stopped spinning, pointing southwest, the wrong direction for the trailhead. But the creature had gone that way. She checked her watch. Nearly 1,700 hours. Dark in 2 hours, maybe less with the storm clouds building overhead. She should turn back. Radio was still static. No way to call for help. The smart move was retreat, regroup, return with a team. But Brandon Mitchell's last photo haunted her. That fear in his eyes when he'd seen what was behind him. If there was any chance he was still alive, still out here somewhere. Jennifer headed southwest, off trail, following the direction the creature had taken. The forest grew denser as she climbed, rhododendron giving way to mountain laurel thickets that forced her to crawl in places. The light was fading fast, filtered through heavy clouds that were starting to spit freezing rain. She found the first evidence half a mile in, fabric caught on branches. Part of a jacket, torn badly with dark stains that might have been blood. She bagged it, kept moving. 50 yards further, a broken tripod leg. Then a lens filter, cracked. A trail of breadcrumbs leading deeper into the mountains, into sections of the park she'd only seen on maps. Areas too remote and dangerous for maintained trails. The forest opened suddenly into a ravine she didn't recognize. A creek ran through it, swollen with snowmelt, and on the far side, Jennifer stopped breathing. Bodies. 3 of them, arranged in a row on a flat shelf of rock. Not fresh. Weeks dead, maybe months for the furthest one. But preserved somehow, the cold and altitude and something else keeping them from decaying normally. She recognized one. Karen Hughes disappeared 6 months ago, presumed to have fallen into a ravine. Another was Tyson Reed, missing nearly a year. Search called off after 2 weeks. And on the end, newest and most carefully positioned, Brandon Mitchell. She forced herself across the creek, ice-cold water soaking her boots, and climbed to the shelf. Brandon lay on his back, arms folded across his chest, eyes closed. He looked almost peaceful except for the expression on his face, the terror frozen there, Whatever he'd seen in his last moments seared into his features permanently. Jennifer checked for a pulse she knew wouldn't be there. His skin was cold, stiff, dead at least 48 hours, which meant he'd died shortly after taking that last photo. On his chest, arranged carefully, was his camera's memory card, and around his neck, a collar. Rope woven with hair and what looked like bone fragments, symbols carved into leather patches attached to it. The same symbols she'd seen on the trees. A marker, a claim of ownership. She heard the breathing before she saw it, that deep, resonant sound coming from above. Jennifer looked up. The creature clung to the cliff face directly overhead, defying gravity. All 4 limbs splayed out like a spider. Its yellow eyes reflected her flashlight beam, and when it smiled, she saw its teeth were red. "You found them," it said in its own voice, not mimicking now. "My collection. The ones who saw, who understood what they were seeing. They belong to me now, as will you." Jennifer ran. No shame in it, no hesitation. You didn't fight what you couldn't kill. And every instinct screaming at her said this thing could not be killed by bear spray or knives or anything she carried. She crashed through the forest, branches tearing at her, the creature's breathing and that terrible laughter following. It was playing again, keeping pace but not overtaking, letting the terror build. Her headlamp beam bounced wildly, showing flashes of trees and rocks and too many shadows. Something hit her from the side hard, slamming her into a tree. She felt ribs crack, couldn't breathe, fell to the ground gasping. The creature loomed over her, and up close she could see details she wished she couldn't. The individual hairs on its body, the texture of its skin where it showed through, the wrongness of its anatomy. It reached down with those 2 long arms, claws catching her jacket, lifting her effortlessly. She fumbled for the bear spray, but it was gone, knocked away in the fall. The creature pulled her closer and its breath washed over her face, hot and foul. "You chose this," it said. "Remember that. You chose to know." It carried her through the forest, moving on 3 limbs while holding her with the 4th, navigating terrain that should have been impassable. She tried to fight, to break free, but the pain in her ribs was enormous, and its grip was iron. They climbed higher, further from the trails into the true wilderness where no tourists ever went. The creature brought her to a cave entrance she'd never seen on any park map. Wide mouth in the mountainside, darkness beyond, and that smell, overwhelming now, choking. It threw her inside and she hit the ground hard, vision graying at the edges. When she could focus again, she saw the interior by the light of her fallen headlamp. The cave went back deep, maybe 50 feet, and the walls were covered in those symbols, carved, painted in substances she didn't want to identify, scratched by claws into the limestone. And in the back, arranged in careful rows, bones, human bones, dozens of skulls, maybe more, years of hunting, decades, maybe centuries. This thing had been taking people from these mountains longer than the Park Service had existed, longer than America had existed. The creature crouched at the cave entrance, blocking escape, watching her with those yellow eyes. "You wanted to know what happened to the photographer," it said. "Now you know. He died quickly, in terror, but quickly. The others," it gestured at the bones. "They took longer. Some fought, some begged, some tried to bargain. All failed." Jennifer forced herself to her knees, ignoring the grinding pain in her ribs. Her mag light was still clipped to her belt. She grabbed it, held it up not as a weapon, but as light pushing back the darkness. "Why?" Her voice came out raspy. "Why do this?" "Because this is my territory. Because your kind keeps encroaching, building your trails deeper into my forest, bringing your machines and your noise and your arrogance. Because someone must maintain the boundary. Someone must be the consequence for those who disrespect the old places." "You're not real," Jennifer said, and even as the words left her mouth she knew how insane they sounded. "You can't be real. You're just a legend?" The creature laughed. "A story told by mountain people to scare children? I am older than their stories, Ranger. I was here before the Cherokee, before the Yuchi, before any human named these mountains. I am what remains when the old world refuses to surrender to the new. It moved closer and she pressed back against the cave wall, bones crunching under her. But you interest me more than the others. You have killed. You understand death's weight. So I offer you something I've offered no one before. The creature extended one clawed hand, palm up. Join me. Become what I am. Guard these mountains with me. Hunt the trespassers. Maintain the boundary between worlds. You would be powerful, eternal. No more human weakness, no more fear of death. Just the hunt, forever, in these beautiful mountains. Jennifer stared at it, at the offered hand, at the intelligence in those yellow eyes. Part of her, the part that was broken from 3 tours in Afghanistan, that woke up screaming from dreams of burning vehicles and dying friends, almost wanted to say yes. To become something other than human, to leave behind the guilt and the memories and the weight of being Jennifer Nakamura who'd survived when better people hadn't. But she thought about Brandon Mitchell's girlfriend waiting for news that would never come. Thought about the other families, the unsolved disappearances, the parents who would never know their children's fate. Thought about every hiker who'd walk these trails in spring, unaware of what watched them from the shadows. No, she said. The creature's expression didn't change, but something flickered in its eyes. Maybe respect, maybe disappointment. Then you will die here. Another skull for my collection. Another warning that went unheeded. It moved forward, claws extended, and Jennifer threw the maglite at its face. Not as attack, but as distraction. In the instant it flinched, she rolled sideways, grabbed a femur from the bone pile, thick, heavy, the only weapon available, and swung with all her strength at the creature's knee. The bone connected. The creature shrieked, a sound like 1,000 goats screaming, and stumbled. Jennifer didn't wait. She ran for the entrance, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything except the need to move. She made it outside as the creature recovered, launching itself after her with that impossible speed. But she'd fought in mountains before, knew how to use terrain. Jennifer scrambled up the slope beside the cave entrance, grabbed handholds in the rock, climbed with technique born from scaling Afghan compounds under fire. The creature followed, faster, gaining. She reached a narrow ledge 20 feet up and kept going, hands bleeding from the sharp limestone, ribs screaming. 30 feet, 40. The rock face was nearly vertical here, and below she could hear the creature climbing, hear its breathing and those terrible voice sounds it made. Jennifer's hand found the top of the cliff. She pulled herself up and over, collapsed on flat ground, gasping, looked back down. The creature was 10 feet below, climbing steadily, eyes locked on her. She grabbed the largest rock she could lift and shoved it over the edge. It hit the creature center mass. For one instant, the thing hung there, claws dug into stone, and Jennifer saw surprise in its expression. Then the rock's momentum tore it loose and it fell, tumbling, shrieking, hitting the ground 40 feet down with a sound like breaking wood. Jennifer looked over the edge, breathing hard. The creature lay motionless at the cliff base, limbs at wrong angles, body broken. As she watched, it twitched once, twice, then went still. She didn't trust it. Scrambled away from the edge, oriented herself using the stars barely visible through storm clouds. Southwest. She needed to go northeast to hit the main trail system. Started walking, then jogging despite the pain, putting distance between herself and that place. The freezing rain turned to sleet, then snow. Jennifer kept moving, using every bit of training to navigate by stars and terrain. Found a stream, followed it downhill. Streams led to valleys, valleys led to trails. Basic wilderness survival. Dawn found her stumbling out onto Route 441, the main road through the park. A maintenance truck stopped, and the driver, a seasonal employee she barely knew, took one look at her and grabbed his radio. They medevaced her to Knoxville. 3 broken ribs and severe hypothermia. She told them she'd fallen, that she'd gotten lost in the storm searching for Brandon Mitchell, that she'd spent the night in an emergency shelter. The investigating rangers found her story plausible. These things happened, The mountains were dangerous. She told them she'd found Mitchell's body in a ravine, gave them coordinates from memory. They recovered him 3 days later, along with the other 2 missing persons. Official cause of death: exposure and blunt force trauma consistent with falls. The bodies were in rough shape. Animal predation, the report said. Natural scavenger activity. Jennifer didn't correct them, didn't mention the cave or the bones or the symbols, didn't describe what she'd seen because she knew exactly how that conversation would go. They'd put her on psychiatric leave, maybe permanent medical discharge. The thing she'd fought would remain unknown, free to continue hunting, but she couldn't just leave it. Not with those skulls in the cave, not with the knowledge that it was still out there. So she did something that would have gotten her fired if anyone found out. She went back. 3 weeks later, ribs healed enough to climb. Jennifer returned to those remote sections of the park, brought climbing gear, a real weapon this time, a Ruger 44 Magnum that had cost her a month's salary, and she'd smuggled into the park hidden in her personal vehicle. Also brought something else: gasoline. Lots of it. Finding the cave again took 2 days, but she found it. The creature's body was gone. Either it had survived and fled, or something else had taken it. But the bones remained, and the symbols on the walls. Jennifer photographed everything, documented it all. Then she poured gasoline throughout the cave, struck a flare, and walked away as flames roared behind her. Fire was primal, universal. If legends could be killed, fire would do it. If they couldn't, well, at least she destroyed the trophy room. She never saw the creature again. But sometimes, on night shifts, she heard things in the deep forest: breathing, laughter, voices that shouldn't exist calling from the darkness. And once, checking a trail camera that had stopped working, she found the memory card removed and placed carefully on the ground, with symbols scratched in the dirt around it. Jennifer stopped leading search and rescue missions after that, transferred to the visitor center, to education programs, to places where she didn't have to go into the deep woods. Some people thought she'd lost her nerve. Her supervisor recommended counseling for PTSD, assuming her trauma was from Afghanistan and not Tennessee. She let them think that. Better than the truth. But she watched the missing person reports now with a different understanding. Watched for patterns. Experienced hikers vanishing without trace. Searches that found equipment but no bodies. Cases where the evidence didn't quite make sense. 3 times in the next 2 years, she saw those patterns. 3 times she went back into those mountains armed and prepared, following trails that weren't on any map. She never found the creature again. Maybe she'd killed it. Maybe it had moved to different territory. Maybe it was just being more careful now, more selective, remembering the ranger who'd fought back and survived. Or maybe it was waiting, patient, eternal, knowing that eventually she'd make a mistake, let her guard down, go too deep into the forest on the wrong night. Jennifer Nakamura stopped sleeping well, stopped trusting the forest the way she once had, started seeing shadows that might be more than shadows, hearing sounds that might be warnings. The mountains she'd loved, that she'd chosen as her refuge after war, had become something else. Something that watched, something that waited. And on very quiet nights, when the wind was right and the moon was dark, she could still hear it. That breathing, that laughter, that ancient, patient voice reminding her that some boundaries should not be crossed. Some territories belong to things older and more terrible than human understanding. She'd found Brandon Mitchell. She'd brought him home. But the cost was knowing, truly knowing what walked those mountains in the places between the trails, what waited for the lost, the curious, the ones who saw too clearly. The goatman was real, and it was still out there. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The tent fabric had frozen mid-ripple, as if someone had paused the world while tearing through it from the inside. Daniel Kowalski stood at the edge of Ashley Nguyen's campsite, his 3 months of ranger training suddenly feeling like 3 minutes. The Coleman lantern still glowed inside the tent, impossible after 4 days, casting shadows of claw marks across the nylon walls. Not cuts, not tears, claw marks, as if something with fingers too long and joints that bent wrong had tried to claw its way out while the fabric crystallized around each furrow. The thermometer clipped to his pack read 42 degrees. The ground around the tent had frost patterns Daniel had never seen in any manual, spiraling outward like something breathing had frozen the earth in concentric circles. His breath didn't fog. That wrongness took him 3 full seconds to process. His breath should fog at 42 degrees, especially at 7,000 feet in North Cascades in November. But the air leaving his lungs stayed invisible, as if the cold here worked differently. Ashley Nguyen's hiking boots sat outside the tent entrance, laces still tied, positioned as though she'd stepped out of them mid-stride. No scuff marks, no prints in the frost, just boots that shouldn't be able to stand upright on their own, yet did, pointing toward the tree line where the evergreens grew so thick they looked like a wall of black. Daniel keyed his radio. "Base, this is Ranger Kowalski. I'm at the Cascade Pass Trail campsite, approximately mile marker 9.3. The missing hiker's gear is here. Tent is intact, but..." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't make him sound insane on his first solo recovery mission. "There are unusual markings. Requesting guidance." Static, then more static. Not the normal hiss of distance or interference, but a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. Almost like something was listening to the frequency and deciding whether to let his words through. "Base, do you copy?" The static intensified, and beneath it, or maybe he imagined it, a sound like ice cracking in a voice box. Daniel released the transmit button, his hand shaking enough that he noticed. 3 months ago, he'd been installing fiber optic cable in Seattle. The Park Service job had seemed like an adventure, a way to use his emergency response certification somewhere that mattered. Now he stood alone at 7,200 feet with a missing persons camp that looked like it had been visited by something that broke the laws of thermodynamics. The lantern inside the tent flickered. Impossible. Coleman fuel doesn't last 4 days, and the flame looked steady through the rip marks, not the wavering of a dying wick. Daniel approached slowly, his mag light feeling inadequate in his grip. Department issue LED flashlights were on back order. He had this 1990s surplus that his supervisor, Ranger Mitchell, had tossed him with a grunt. "Batteries are cheaper than your panic," Mitchell had said. Daniel wished Mitchell were here now, instead of covering the southern district. He unzipped the tent fly with fingers gone clumsy from cold that shouldn't exist. The Coleman sat in the center, burning clean and blue. Ashley's sleeping bag lay spread open, and on top of it, arranged with the precision of a museum display, were 12 Polaroid photographs. Daniel's stomach tried to crawl up his throat. Polaroids. He lifted the first one with tweezers from his first aid kit, contaminating evidence, but some instinct told him touching these directly would be worse. The photo showed Ashley Nguyen. He recognized her from the missing person report. Vietnamese-American athletic build, 28, wearing the same North Face jacket visible in the tent's corner. In the Polaroid, she stood on a trail Daniel didn't recognize, smiling at the camera. Normal hiking selfie. The timestamp in the corner read 11/14/07, 3 days ago. The second photo showed the same angle, same pose. Ashley's smile had frozen into something that wasn't quite a smile anymore, lips pulled back too far, showing too many teeth. The timestamp read 11/14/07, same day, but the light had changed. Dimmer, wrong. Third photo. Ashley's face had begun to elongate. Her jaw extended forward like someone had grabbed her chin and pulled. Her eyes, though, her eyes stayed the same, human, terrified, aware. Timestamp still 11/14/07. Daniel's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the photo. He forced himself to look at the fourth. The progression continued through 12 images, each one time-stamped 11/14/07, each one showing Ashley's transformation into something that made Daniel's hindbrain scream. The final photograph showed a figure that might have started as Ashley Nguyen, but had been stretched and reformed into angles that hurt to perceive. Its limbs were too long, joints reversed, skin pulled tight over a frame that looked starved despite the grotesque size. The mouth had distended, full of teeth that looked like ice chips. And the eyes, still Ashley's eyes, still human, still aware, stared at the camera with an expression Daniel would see every time he closed his eyes for the rest of his life, however long that lasted. The creature in the final photo stood in front of a trail marker. Daniel's vision swam as he recognized it. Cascade Pass Trail, mile marker 12. 3 miles from here, 3 miles deeper into the backcountry where the maps had warning symbols he'd thought were jokes. Extreme isolation beyond this point. Unexplained disappearances documented 1923 present. A sound outside the tent made Daniel's head snap up. Not wind, not an animal. Something between the two. A whistling that formed shapes almost like words. He grabbed the photos, stuffed them into his jacket's inner pocket with shaking hands, and crawled out of the tent into air that had dropped 30 degrees in the 3 minutes he'd been inside. His breath still didn't fog. The tree line where he'd seen only darkness now held shapes. Tall shapes. Too tall. Moving between the pines with a gait that suggested legs with too many joints. Daniel's maglite beam hit the nearest one, and for a moment he saw Ashley Nguyen's face. Her real face, the one from her driver's license photo, superimposed over a skull that extended forward into a muzzle of ice and teeth. It smiled at him. Ashley's smile. Ashley's eyes. Then it was gone, moving laterally faster than anything that size should move, and the whistling intensified into what his training tried to call wind, but his instincts knew was language. Old language. Algonquian maybe, or something older, from before the tribes that eventually became the Algonquian had names. Daniel ran. His training said never run from predators. His training said maintain situational awareness, radio for backup, follow emergency protocols. His training evaporated in the face of the sound now chasing him. Not footsteps, but the crack of ice forming and shattering with each stride, moving through the forest like a winter that had learned to hunt. He made it 50 yards before he realized he was running toward mile marker 12, not away from it. The trail had turned without him noticing. The trees had rearranged themselves. Daniel skidded to a halt, his boots finding purchase on frost that formed patterns, spirals like breath, like the ground around Ashley's tent. And something in those patterns pulled at his vision, made him want to follow them deeper, made him want to. Hungry. The word came from inside his skull, but it wasn't his thought. So hungry. Daniel fumbled for his radio. Base, this is Kowalski, emergency, I have... Static drowned his words, but beneath the static, clear as a bell, he heard Ashley Nguyen's voice. Help me. Not a recording, not interference. Her voice, live, transmitted on the frequency, saying words that made his hands freeze on the radio. I'm so cold, Daniel. It won't stop. I keep eating, but I'm so cold and I'm so hungry and I can't stop. Daniel dropped the radio. It hit the frost and cracked, the LCD screen going dark, but Ashley's voice continued to whisper from the speaker, describing hunger in terms that made Daniel's stomach cramp with sympathetic nausea. She described tasting the forest, tasting the wind, tasting her own fingers, her own lips, the inside of her mouth turning to something that needed to consume, needed to fill the cold. But nothing filled it. Nothing ever filled it. And the more she ate, the hungrier she became. The more the cold expanded until she wasn't Ashley anymore. She was the winter itself. She was the hunger made manifest. And she could see Daniel now. See him standing on the trail with his fear tasting so sweet, so warm. If she could just... Daniel stomped on the radio. The plastic crunched. Ashley's voice cut off mid-word. The silence that followed was worse. He could hear his pulse in his ears. Could hear the frost continuing to form around his boots. That same spiral pattern, extending outward like veins. Could hear in the distance something moving through the trees with the sound of breaking ice and splintering bone. The Polaroids in his jacket pocket felt cold against his chest. Colder than they should. Through the fabric he could feel them, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he looked at them again, there would be 13 photos instead of 12. 13 photos, and the newest one would show him. Think. His training tried to assert itself through the panic. Ashley had disappeared 4 days ago on November 14th. Today was November 18th. The Polaroids all showed the same date, the day she disappeared, but documented a transformation that should have taken longer, or should never have happened at all, if Daniel lived in a world that made sense. But he'd stopped living in that world the moment he'd seen the tent with its impossible lantern and frost that spiraled like breath. Wendigo. The word appeared in his mind fully formed, pulled from a Wikipedia article he'd skimmed during his orientation, back when the park's history of disappearances had seemed like local color for tourists. Algonquian mythology, a spirit of winter, hunger, and cannibalism. Those who consumed human flesh in desperation became possessed, transformed into creatures of insatiable appetite. The more they ate, the more they grew, the hungrier they became, locked in a cycle that only ended when they were destroyed, or when winter itself ended. But those were stories. Legends. The kind of thing you told around campfires to make the darkness seem less empty. The whistling started again, closer now, and Daniel heard Ashley's voice woven through it, speaking words that might have been Algonquian or might have been older, might have been the language winter spoke before humans gave it names. He had two choices: go back to his truck at the trailhead 5 miles downhill, or go forward to the ranger station at Cascade Pass, 3 miles uphill. The truck meant safety, distance, the ability to leave. The station meant the emergency radio, the landline that actually worked, the supply cache with flares and the rifle nobody was supposed to know about. Something crashed through the underbrush to his left. Daniel glimpsed it between the pines, tall as the trees themselves, skeletal, moving on legs that bent wrong. Its head turned backward to look at him with eyes that were still, impossibly, Ashley Nguyen's eyes, still aware, still human enough to beg. He ran for the station. The trail climbed steeply, elevation gain that burned his legs and lungs. The air tasted wrong, metallic, like breathing through a mouthful of pennies. His maglite beam caught movement in every shadow, but when he turned to look directly, nothing was there. Only the trees and the frost and the spiral patterns that seemed to follow him up the trail like footprints. Mile marker 10 appeared in his beam, then 10.5. The whistling never stopped, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind, sometimes coming from directions that didn't exist. Once he heard Ashley's voice again, not from his broken radio, but from the trees themselves, and she was crying, saying she was sorry, so sorry, she hadn't meant to. She'd found the hiker from last year, and he was frozen but still alive somehow, still breathing. And she'd been so hungry, 3 days lost and no food, and she'd just taken a little, just a bite, just to survive. And then Daniel clamped his hands over his ears and kept running. The ranger station materialized out of the darkness at mile marker 11.8, a squat log structure that looked like salvation. Daniel's frozen fingers fumbled with the key, dropped it, found it again. The lock turned. The door swung open. He fell inside and slammed it behind him, throwing the deadbolt and the crossbar, his back against the wood, gasping. The station's interior lay in darkness. Daniel's flashlight found the emergency radio on the desk, the landline phone, the supply lockers. Normal. Everything normal. He could call for help, could get a helicopter, could... The frost patterns were inside the station, on the floor, spiraling outward from a point near the back wall where the supply locker stood open, the locker where the rifle should be. The locker that was empty except for 12 Polaroid photographs laid out in a neat row. Daniel's legs gave out. He caught himself on the desk, his flashlight clattering to the floor, beam spinning wildly across the ceiling where he saw messages, carved into the wooden beams. Not English. Not any language he recognized, but he could read them anyway. The meaning searing itself into his brain. Warnings, prayers, names of the dead, and dates going back to 1923, when the first documented disappearance had occurred. Hundreds of names, hundreds of dates, all during winter, all in November, December, January. The final message, carved yesterday according to the fresh wood shavings still on the floor. Ashley Nguyen, forgive me. Daniel grabbed the landline, dead. He grabbed the emergency radio, static, and under it, breathing. He keyed the transmit button anyway, voice breaking. This is Ranger Daniel Kowalski, North Cascades, Cascade Pass Station. I need immediate extraction. I have... Daniel. Ashley's voice from the radio speaker. Not distorted. Clear. Close. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I'm so hungry. The frost spirals on the floor began to move, extending toward him like fingers. Daniel backed toward the door, his hand finding the crossbar, lifting it, pulling. The door wouldn't open. From outside, he heard the whistling, and beneath it the sound of ice forming against the wood, sealing him in. The photographs in the supply locker began to move. Not wind. The images themselves moving, the progression playing out in reverse. Ashley transforming from monster back to human, frame by frame, and with each frame the frost spirals extended further into the room, and the temperature dropped, and Daniel's breath finally fogged, thick and white, freezing in the air before him. A sound behind him. Daniel turned. Ashley Nguyen stood in the doorway to the station's back room. The real Ashley, not the creature from the photographs. She wore her North Face jacket and her hiking boots, and she looked exactly like her driver's license photo, except for her eyes. Her eyes were holes in her face, windows to a winter that had no end, a hunger that had no bottom. I tried to stop, she said, and her voice was her own voice, human and broken and aware. After I ate him, the hiker from last year, I tried to stop, but it changed me. I can feel it growing inside. The more I resist, the colder I get. The colder I get, the hungrier I become. And it's not just physical hunger anymore, it's everything. I'm hungry for warmth, for life, for the memory of being warm. I'm hungry for the smell of coffee and the feeling of sunlight and the taste of my mother's cooking. I'm hungry for every sensation I've ever felt, and consuming them makes me hunger for more. She took a step closer. The frost followed her, coating the floor, climbing the walls. Daniel's back hit the door. The wood had frozen solid, no escape. The ranger before you, Ashley continued, and tears froze on her cheeks as she spoke. He found me yesterday. He understood what was happening. He'd read the histories, the warnings carved in the beams. He knew the only way to stop the transformation was to starve it, to refuse to feed the hunger no matter what. Daniel's eyes went to the names carved overhead. Found one from yesterday, Marcus Chen, his supervisor, the ranger who'd called in sick this week, who'd sent Daniel on this recovery mission alone. He'd locked himself in here, Ashley said, with the rifle. He tried to stop me by stopping himself, but I found him before he could. And I was so hungry, Daniel, so hungry. And now there's nothing left of him but his name on the ceiling and his warmth inside me. And it's already fading, and I'm so cold again. She was close enough now that Daniel could see the frost forming in her hair, could see the way her jaw was starting to extend, could see her fingers lengthening into claws of ice and bone. But her eyes still held awareness, still held Ashley Nguyen, the 28-year-old nurse from Portland who'd come hiking alone to process a breakup and clear her head. I don't want to do this, she whispered, but I can't stop. The hunger won't let me stop, even now. Knowing what I'm about to do, hating myself for it, I can already taste you. Can already feel how your warmth will fill the cold for just a few minutes before it comes back worse than before. And I'll hate myself more, and I'll transform more. And eventually there won't be anything left of Ashley Nguyen except a monster that remembers being human. Daniel's hand found his belt knife. Standard issue, 4 inches of carbon steel, laughably inadequate, but Ashley's eyes fixed on it with something like hope. If you can, she said, if you're fast enough, end this, please, before I become something that can't be ended, before I'm all hunger and no memory, while there's still enough of me left to want to die. The frost had coated Daniel's legs, climbing toward his waist, his joints locked, the cold spread through his muscles, making them rigid, making him slow. Ashley's transformation accelerated, her jaw cracking as it extended, her fingers splitting open to reveal ice beneath flesh. Daniel lunged. His knife found her throat, or where her throat should be, but the blade skittered off ice. Ashley's hand, no longer a hand, closed around his wrist. The cold from her touch burned worse than fire, flash freezing his skin, the cells bursting, the nerve endings screaming. "Too slow," she said, and her voice had changed, deepened, become the whistling wind he'd heard in the trees. "And now you'll feed me, and your warmth will sustain me for a little while. And then I'll be hungry again, and I'll walk down this mountain, and I'll find the others, and I'll feed, and I'll grow. And by the time winter ends, if it ever ends, I'll have consumed so much that I'll be winter itself, and the hunger will be eternal." Her mouth opened. Not a mouth anymore, a cavern of ice and teeth, breath visible as crystallizing vapor, and in the depths of that frozen throat Daniel could see Marcus Chen's face, frozen mid-scream, aware, still alive in some horrible way, trapped inside the thing that had consumed him. Daniel did the only thing left to do. With his free hand, numb and clumsy, he pulled the Polaroids from his jacket and threw them at the Coleman lantern still burning impossible on the desk. The photographs caught fire instantly as if they'd been waiting to burn. The flames spread wrong, too fast, too eager, blue-white instead of orange. They engulfed the lantern, the desk, the walls. The carved names on the ceiling beams began to smoke, and with them came voices, hundreds of voices. All the lost hikers, all the consumed, all the trapped, screaming in unison. A sound that transcended mere noise and became a physical force. Ashley shrieked. The thing that had been Ashley shrieked. The flames found her, found the cold inside her, and fire and frost met in a collision that shattered windows, that sent Daniel flying backward through the door, suddenly open, suddenly possible, into the snow that had begun to fall. He landed hard, his frozen hand shattering against a rock, the pain distant and unreal. Behind him, the ranger station burned with flames that gave off no heat, flames that were somehow cold, flames that consumed the structure and everything in it with a sound like ice breaking across a vast lake. Daniel crawled, then walked, then ran, his shattered hand cradled against his chest, following the trail downward through snow that fell thicker with each step. He passed mile marker 11, mile marker 10, mile marker 9, where Ashley's tent stood empty now, the Coleman lantern finally dark. At mile marker 5, he found the first of the search and rescue team that had been dispatched when he'd missed his evening check-in. 3 rangers with spotlights and concern on their faces. Concern that turned to horror when they saw him. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, gave him hot coffee from a thermos. Asked what happened, Daniel opened his mouth to answer and found he couldn't remember how to form words. The cold had reached that deep, freezing his voice, his thoughts, his ability to explain the impossible. Instead, he held up his shattered hand, the one Ashley had grabbed, and they saw the frost patterns spreading across his skin. Spirals, like breath, growing. One of the rangers, an older woman named Sarah, pulled her sidearm. She didn't aim it at him, just held it ready, and in her eyes Daniel saw the same knowledge he'd seen in Marcus Chen's carved name. She knew. They all knew. The stories weren't stories. The warnings weren't warnings for tourists. They were documentation, history, inevitability. "How long since contact?" Sarah asked quietly. Daniel couldn't answer. His jaw had begun to ache, to extend. He felt the first stirrings of hunger that had nothing to do with missing dinner. Hunger for the warmth radiating from the 3 rangers surrounding him. Hunger for the memory of heat. Hunger that would never end. Sarah raised her weapon. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "But we can't let it spread. We can't let what happened in 1923 happen again. 47 people, an entire winter, we barely contained it." Daniel wanted to tell her it was okay, that he understood, that some part of him, the part that was still Daniel Kowalski who'd installed fiber optic cable and thought ranger work would be an adventure, wanted her to pull the trigger before the hunger grew too strong. But the words wouldn't come. Only the whistling came, forming itself in his throat, shaping sounds that predated language, and with those sounds came the cold, spreading through his chest, his skull, his soul. The last thing Daniel Kowalski thought before he became something else was a memory of summer, of heat shimmering off Seattle pavement, of complaining about the temperature, about the sun, about wanting it to be cooler, of taking warmth for granted, of never understanding that cold wasn't just absence of heat, it was a presence, a force, an entity that could think and hunger and consume. And then the thought was gone, replaced by appetite. Sarah fired 3 times. Center mass. Professional. Precise. The bullets punched through Daniel's chest, and for a moment he felt the pain, felt the warmth of his own blood, and that warmth tasted so good, so brief, so insufficient. He took a step toward the Rangers, toward the heat, toward the feast. Sarah fired again, and again, and again, until her magazine was empty and Daniel was still standing, still moving, still hungry. The frost spirals had spread from his hand to cover his entire body, crystallizing over the bullet wounds, sealing them, making them irrelevant. The Rangers ran. Smart. Daniel would have run too, if he'd still been Daniel. But he wasn't Daniel anymore. He was the hunger. He was the winter. He was what happened when humans forgot that cold wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a god, and it demanded sacrifice. He followed them down the trail, moving faster than he should move, his legs bending in new ways, his joints rearranging themselves to maximize speed. He could taste their fear on the wind, could smell their warmth, could hear their hearts pounding as they realized they couldn't outrun him. Mile marker 3. The trees rearranged themselves to make his path easier, to make their path harder. The forest knew him now, recognized him. Welcome, it seemed to say. Welcome home, child of winter, we've been waiting. Mile marker 2. He caught the slowest ranger, the older one, Sarah. She turned to face him at the last moment, weapon raised but empty. She didn't plead, didn't beg. Just looked at him with something like understanding, like acceptance. Like this was always how it would end for someone who'd chosen to work in these mountains. Make it quick, she said. Daniel couldn't make it quick, couldn't make it painless. The hunger didn't allow mercy. It demanded consumption, transformation, addition to the cold. Sarah's warmth flooded into him, filling the void for seconds, maybe minutes, before the hunger returned worse than before, insatiable, eternal. And as he consumed her, he felt her knowledge enter him, her memories, her understanding, the history of the Wendigo in these mountains, the pattern that repeated every few decades, a winter harsh enough, a person desperate enough, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, the transformations, the hunts, the inevitability of it all. The Park Service knew, had always known. That's why they kept detailed records, why they carved the names, why they maintained protocols for rangers who disappeared during winter months, why certain positions like his were given to people with no families, no strong ties, people whose disappearance would cause minimal ripples. Expendable. That's what he'd been from the start. Bait. A canary in a coal mine, except the canary was expected to turn into the mine. The 2 remaining rangers had reached the parking lot. Daniel could smell exhaust from their truck's engine as it roared to life, could taste rubber as the tires spun on ice. They'd make it out. They'd file reports. They'd carve his name in the ranger station. Once they rebuilt it, they'd wait for winter to end, hope that ended him with it. And if it didn't, they'd send someone else. Another expendable ranger. Another attempt at containment. Daniel let them go. Not mercy. Strategy. Let them spread fear. Let them warn others away. The mountain would be his through the winter, and by spring he'd be so transformed, so powerful, that nothing could stop him. He'd walk down into the valleys, into the towns. He'd feed through the warmth of civilization, until civilization was just another memory, frozen in his ever-expanding frame. The snow fell harder now, covering his tracks, covering Sarah's body, covering all evidence that Daniel Kowalski had ever been human. The cold settled into his bones, his new bones, longer, stronger, better suited to the hunt. His jaw finished its transformation, extending into the muzzle of ice and teeth that he'd seen in Ashley's photographs. Somewhere in the back of his fragmenting mind, the last piece of Daniel Kowalski looked out through his new eyes and wept frozen tears. But the hunger drowned that piece, consumed it, added it to the cold. The Wendigo that had been Daniel Kowalski raised its head to the sky and howled. The sound echoed through the North Cascades, a promise and a warning, a claim to territory that would expand with every soul consumed, every warmth stolen, every memory frozen. Winter had come to the mountain, and winter was hungry, and winter would feed. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The fingerprints appeared in 3 locations simultaneously: Emma Sullivan's right index finger on the tent pole, the tree trunk 15 feet away, and the trail register, all with identical timestamps from the digital camera's motion sensor. Daniel Kowalski stood in the center of the abandoned campsite at mile marker 4.7 on Thunder Creek Trail, his Nikon D80 hanging from his neck, and felt the first hairline fracture appear in the foundation of his rational mind. 23 years as a forest ranger, 12 of them in North Cascades National Park, and he'd never encountered evidence that violated basic physics. He'd found bodies, solved disappearances, tracked down lost hikers who'd wandered off trail in states of hypothermic confusion. But he'd never found proof that a person had touched 3 surfaces simultaneously from positions that would require her body to occupy separate points in space. The motion-activated trail camera, a Reconix HC600 that Emma Sullivan had mounted to document wildlife, had captured the timestamps. Daniel had checked it twice, then a third time, his methodical nature demanding absolute certainty before he allowed himself to acknowledge the impossibility. The camera didn't malfunction. The images were clear, sharp, sequential. Frame 447, 2:17:33 a.m., Emma's fingerprint visible on the tent's aluminum pole, illuminated by her headlamp. Frame 448, 2:17:33 a.m., the same print on the Douglas fir's bark, the angle suggesting she'd pressed her full weight against it. Frame 449, 2:17:33 a.m., her hand signing the trail register she'd apparently carried outside, the page fluttering in captured motion. Same second, 3 locations. Physical impossibility. Daniel crouched beside the tent, a big Agnes Copper Spur HVUL2, exactly the kind of gear someone with Emma's backpacking experience would choose. Everything else about the scene screamed normalcy. Sleeping bag arranged neatly inside, camp stove positioned on flat ground with proper clearance, bare canister sealed and hung correctly from the provided cable system. Her Garmin eTrex Vista GPS unit sat on a flat stone, battery dead, but the last waypoint still visible on the screen. Camp Night 3, elevation 3,147 feet. Coordinates that matched their current position exactly. She'd done everything right. That was what made this wrong. Daniel pulled out his notebook, the same write in the rain pad he'd carried for 2 decades, and began cataloging. Emma Sullivan, 26, Seattle resident, experienced backpacker with a summit list that included Rainier and Baker. Reported missing by her sister after she failed to return from a planned 5-day solo trek. The report had come in 72 hours ago. Daniel had hiked in yesterday, following Thunder Creek Trail from the Colonial Creek campground, making steady time through old-growth cedar and hemlock. He'd expected to find her injured, maybe hypothermic, possibly dead from a fall or animal encounter. Not this. Never this. His Motorola CP200 radio crackled with static, the signal weak this far into the backcountry. Kowalski, this is base. Status update. He pressed the transmit button. This is Kowalski. I'm at her last known campsite. Situation is unusual. Sending coordinates for additional personnel. Copy that. What's unusual mean? Daniel looked at the 3 evidence markers he'd placed. Small orange flags numbered sequentially. How did you explain impossible physics over a radio? How did you tell your supervisor that you'd found evidence of a person existing in multiple places at once, without sounding like you'd lost your mind? I'll have a full report when I return. Right now I need to expand the search radius. She left the campsite, but the trail signs are inconsistent. Inconsistent how? I'll explain in person. Kowalski out. He switched off the radio before any follow-up questions could come through. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain the footprints either. They started normal enough. Emma's Salomon hiking boots, women's size 8, distinctive tread pattern he'd memorized from the missing person file. The prints led northeast from her tent, moving upslope toward the ridge that separated Thunder Creek from Fisher Creek. Standard evacuation route if she'd encountered trouble. The prints were evenly spaced, suggesting a normal walking pace, no signs of running or panic. Then at 30 yards they changed. The left footprint remained human. The right one transformed mid-stride into something else. 4 distinct pad marks, claw indentations, the spacing and depth consistent with a large canid, wolf maybe, or a particularly large coyote. Except the stride length didn't change. Whatever had made that print had been moving at the same pace as the human footfalls, matching rhythm and direction exactly. 10 yards further, both prints were animal. 20 yards after that, human again. Then a stretch where the left prints were human and the right were bird-like. 3 forward-facing toes and 1 rear-facing, too large for any species Daniel knew inhabited these mountains. He documented everything with photographs using a ruler for scale, noting the soil composition and moisture content. His training screamed contamination, multiple overlapping tracks, coincidental positioning. But his eyes saw the impossible truth. These prints formed a single trail, one set of tracks that transformed as they progressed, as if Emma Sullivan had been shifting between forms with each step. Daniel followed them. The analytical part of his brain, the part that had carried him through 2 decades of rational problem-solving, had retreated somewhere deep and quiet. What remained was older, more instinctive. The part that remembered his grandmother's stories, dismissed as superstition, relegated to childhood memory. Stories she told in Polish, switching to English only when his mother insisted. Stories about things that walked on 2 legs and 4, that wore human faces, but weren't human underneath. Striga, she'd called them. Creatures born wrong, hungry for more than food. But this was Washington State, not old country Poland. This was North Cascades National Park in 2007, a place of rational explanations and documented wildlife. Daniel had taken courses in forensic tracking. He understood decomposition rates and predation patterns. He knew that animals didn't transform, that shapeshifting belonged to folklore, not to his incident reports. The tracks led upslope, winding between glacial erratic boulders and stands of mountain hemlock. The elevation increased steadily, 4,000 feet, 4,200, 45. Daniel's breathing came harder, the October air thin and sharp with approaching winter. He'd grabbed his day pack, leaving the tent and its impossible evidence marked with GPS coordinates for the follow-up team. His pack held the essentials: water filter, energy bars, first aid kit, space blanket, headlamp, spare batteries, and his service Glock 22, which he'd carried for 15 years and never fired outside the range. The weight of the pistol against his hip felt suddenly inadequate. At 4,800 feet, the prints disappeared entirely, not gradually, not obscured by rocky terrain. They simply stopped at the edge of a small clearing, as if Emma Sullivan had stepped from soil onto air and kept walking into nothing. Daniel stood at the termination point, turning slowly, scanning for any continuation. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across, carpeted with kinnikinick and bear grass. The vegetation showed no signs of disturbance, no broken stems, no compressed growth patterns. She hadn't walked across this space, but something had. The trees surrounding the clearing bore marks, deep parallel gouges in the bark, 4 lines each, spaced like claw swipes, except they were too high, 8 feet up the trunk on average, some reaching 10. No bear could reach that height standing upright. The gouges were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds, the exposed wood pale and raw. Daniel approached the nearest tree, a subalpine fir, and examined the marks more closely. They weren't random. Each set of 4 gouges formed a pattern, the spacing and depth deliberate. He'd seen enough territorial marking to recognize it, but the scale was wrong, the height impossible for any animal that should exist in these mountains. His radio crackled again. "Kowalski, this is base. We're sending Peterson and Martinez as backup. ETA 4 hours. Confirm receipt." "Confirmed," Daniel said, his voice steady, despite the wrongness pressing against him from every direction. "Tell them to bring climbing gear and spotlights." "Copy. Are you in danger?" The question hung in the thin mountain air. Was he? The evidence suggested Emma had encountered something that defied explanation, something that could alter its physical form, that could mark trees at heights that should be impossible. But evidence of past danger didn't equal present threat. Except it did. He knew it did. The instinct that had kept him safe through 2 decades of wilderness work was screaming now, a primal alarm his rational mind kept trying to silence. "Negative," he lied. "Just being thorough. Kowalski out." He continued circling the clearing, cataloging the marked trees. 15 in total, forming a rough perimeter. The marks were identical in style but varied in depth, as if applied with increasing force. Practice, maybe. Or escalation. On the far side of the clearing, he found the shrine. It wasn't modern construction. The stones stacked in a careful cairn were weathered, lichens growing thick on their surfaces, suggesting decades or longer since placement. Someone had added to it recently, though. Fresh pine boughs arranged in a specific pattern, 3 cigarettes placed in a triangle formation, their filters touching, and at the center, a Polaroid photograph. Daniel's hand shook as he picked it up. The image showed Emma Sullivan, smiling at the camera, standing in this exact clearing with her arms spread wide. The photo had that instant quality of Polaroid film, slightly overexposed, colors slightly off. But Emma's expression was clear enough. Pure joy, the kind of unguarded happiness people wore when they thought they were alone in nature. Except she hadn't been alone. In the tree line behind her, barely visible among the shadows and undergrowth, stood a figure, tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that didn't quite resolve into human geometry. The image quality was too poor to discern features, but Daniel could make out the basic shape. Something standing upright on 2 legs, but with limbs that bent at too many angles, and a head that seemed both too large and too flat to be human. He flipped the Polaroid over. On the back, written in Emma's handwriting, he'd seen enough of her trail register entries to recognize it, were 3 words. It showed me. Daniel's analytical mind tried to process this. Emma had taken the photo herself, some kind of delayed timer shot. The figure was probably a trick of shadows, pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to see faces and forms in random patterns. She'd been out here alone, maybe experiencing early-stage hypothermia, judgment impaired. She'd seen something that wasn't there, captured it on film because our cameras record what our eyes think they see, not objective reality. Except that didn't explain the handwriting. The calm, clear script. No tremor, no panic. It showed me. Showed her what? A branch snapped behind him. Daniel spun, hand moving automatically to his pistol. The clearing remained empty. The tree line showed nothing but shadow and bark and the slow swaying of branches in the wind that had picked up as afternoon slid toward evening. But he'd heard it? Distinct, deliberate. Not the random crack of settling wood or animal passage. Something large had stepped on deadfall, not caring if it made noise. "Emma?" His voice carried across the clearing, too loud in the mountain silence. "Emma Sullivan, if you can hear me, I'm here to help. I'm Forest Ranger Daniel Kowalski. Your sister sent us to find you." The wind died. The sudden absence of sound was more unsettling than any noise. The constant white noise of mountain wilderness, wind through needles, bird calls, insect hum, the distant rush of Thunder Creek far below, all of it stopped simultaneously, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire forest. In that silence, Daniel heard breathing, not his own. This came from multiple directions at once, from the tree line to his north and south, from somewhere above in the canopy, from the ground itself. Deep rhythmic exhalations that didn't match any respiratory pattern he recognized. Too slow for a human in distress, too fast for a resting animal. And underneath the breathing, a sound like grinding, like bone scraping bone, like something working its jaw in preparation for feeding. Daniel drew his weapon. The Glock felt absurdly small in his hand, a child's toy against whatever made that sound. But it was something. Action. Response. The illusion of control. "I'm armed," he announced, hating how his voice shook. "Federal officer, identify yourself." The breathing stopped. What replaced it was worse. A voice, feminine, familiar from the recordings Emma's sister had provided. Emma's voice coming from 3 locations simultaneously, overlapping but not quite synchronized, creating a dissonant echo effect. Daniel Kowalski, 23 years service, born March 15, 1964, Tacoma, Washington. Mother Carol, deceased 2003. Father Stephen, deceased 1998. No siblings, no children. Divorced 2005, live alone in employee housing, Unit 7B, Marble Mount. His personnel file. She was reciting his personnel file. Information that should be secure, locked in administrative systems, not available to a missing hiker who'd been in the wilderness for days. "Who are you?" His gun swept across the clearing, tracking the sources of the voice, finding nothing. "You came looking for me." The words came from directly behind him now, close enough that he should feel breath on his neck. Daniel spun, finger on the trigger guard, muzzle pointing at empty air. Nothing. No one. Just the shrine with its Polaroid and cigarettes and ancient stones. "The tracks," the voice continued now from above, from the canopy itself. "You followed them. Very thorough, very analytical. That's why they sent you. You don't give up on mysteries. Emma, if you're hurt, I can help you. Whatever you've experienced, we can..." "I'm not Emma anymore." The voice had changed. Deeper now, resonant, carrying harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a human throat. And it came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him, pressing against him like physical weight. "She invited me in, Daniel Kowalski. She came to this place, this sacred place, and she asked to understand. She wanted to see what lived in the spaces between. She wanted the truth behind the stories. And I showed her." Daniel's mind raced through the briefing materials. Emma Sullivan, graduate student in anthropology at University of Washington, specializing in indigenous folklore of the Pacific Northwest. Her sister had mentioned she'd been researching something for her dissertation, had been excited about a discovery she'd made in the park archives. "You're researching skinwalker legends," he said, forcing his voice steady. "The Navajo traditions. But those come from the Southwest, not Washington. There's no cultural presence here." The sound that followed might have been laughter. It echoed wrong, bouncing off the trees at angles that violated acoustics, reaching his ears from impossible directions. "You give the name of one tradition. But we are older than names, older than the people who learned to fear us. We were here when your grandmother told you stories about the Sturziga. We were here when Emma read about the Yi-Naldlushi. We were here when the first humans crossed the land bridge and saw us watching from the tree line, and created words to explain what they witnessed." The temperature dropped. Daniel watched his breath plume in the air, sudden and thick, though moments before the afternoon had been mild for October. Frost began forming on the Kinnickinnic, spreading outward from the shrine in a perfect circle. "We wear many names because we wear many shapes. That is our nature. To be between, to be transition. The moment when one thing becomes another." The trees at the clearing's edge began to move, not swaying in wind. There was no wind. Moving deliberately, their trunks bending with the fluid quality of living muscle rather than rigid wood. The bark rippled, patterns flowing across the surface like oil on water. And in those patterns, Daniel saw faces, human faces pressing outward from inside the trees, mouths open in silent screams, hands reaching toward him through wood that suddenly seemed more membrane than solid matter. Emma's face was among them. He recognized her from the missing person photos, but wrong. Stretched, distorted, her features pulled across too much area, her eyes too far apart, her mouth extending nearly to where her ears should be. She wanted to see, the voice said, now coming from Emma's tree-trapped mouth, her lips moving out of sync with the words. She wanted to understand. So I let her look through my eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough to see what I see. "What do you see?" Daniel heard himself ask, the question escaping before his rational mind could stop it. Everything. All at once. Every form. Every possibility. The space between human and animal. Between solid and spirit. Between alive and dead. We don't shift between shapes, Daniel Kowalski. We exist in all shapes simultaneously. Your limited perception forces us into one form at a time, but we are always plural, always transitional, always becoming. The faces in the trees pressed harder against the bark. Emma's stretched mouth opened wider, dislocating, unhinging, revealing depths that went too far back, darkness that extended beyond where her skull should end. She couldn't hold it. The seeing. Human minds aren't built for plurality. They need singular perspective, linear time, discrete boundaries. When I showed her how to see as I see, her mind tried to be in all places at once. It broke her very beautifully. Daniel's gun hand was shaking now, the muzzle wavering between targets that weren't really there, or were everywhere. He couldn't tell anymore. The clearing seemed to be expanding and contracting simultaneously, growing larger while closing in around him. The fingerprints, he managed. The tracks. Her last moments of consciousness. Trying to exist in multiple locations because she'd seen how I do it. Reaching for tent and tree and register all at once. Walking on 2 feet and 4 and none. Your camera captured the truth. She was there all at once until she finally came apart. Where is she now? The question hung in the crystallizing air. The faces in the trees had multiplied. Dozens of them now, hundreds, all showing some version of Emma Sullivan mid-transformation, caught between human and other, frozen in the moment of becoming. Everywhere you looked today, the fingerprints were her reaching, the tracks were her walking. The voice you're hearing is her vocal cords, borrowed and shared and spread thin across multiple throats. She's in the trees and the stones and the soil. She's between forms now, like me, still transitioning. It takes a long time for humans to finish the change. Let her go. Daniel surprised himself with the firmness of the command. Whatever you've done to her, reverse it. Release her. Release her to what? Her old form? That shape can't contain what she knows now. Her mind opened too wide. Closing it would kill her more thoroughly than any transformation. Daniel's analytical nature fought through the horror, grasping for logic, for procedure, for anything that made sense. What do you want? Why tell me this? Why not just... He couldn't finish the sentence. Why not just kill me too, hung unspoken. Because you followed the tracks, Daniel Kowalski. You saw the impossibility and didn't turn away. You documented and analyzed and pushed forward even when the evidence violated everything you understand about reality. That's rare. Most people stop thinking when confronted with the impossible. They dismiss, explain away, refuse to see. But you saw. The faces in the trees began to recede, sinking back into wood, leaving behind smooth bark that showed no evidence of their presence. The frost retreated. The temperature rose slightly, though not enough to feel warm. Evening was coming regardless, the sun dropping behind McMillan Spire to the west, long shadows reaching across the clearing. I could show you, like I showed Emma, let you see through multiple eyes, exist in multiple forms, understand the spaces between categories your language forces you to think within. Would you like that, Daniel? Would you like to be free of singular perspective? Every instinct screamed no. But the analytical part of his mind, the part that had been growing quieter all day, whispered a different answer. Wouldn't understanding this be valuable? Wouldn't documentation of a genuine supernatural entity be worth the personal risk? Wasn't that the job, ultimately? To investigate the unexplained? I'm not a researcher, he said aloud, talking as much to himself as to the presence surrounding him. I'm a ranger. My job is to find Emma Sullivan and bring her home. She is home. She's in every tree you marked, every stone in this shrine, every breath of wind through this clearing. This is what she wanted, to be part of the wilderness she loved, to transcend the boundary between observer and observed. That's not what her family will want. They'll want a body, a burial, closure. I can provide a body. The words carried a terrible promise. Daniel understood immediately. This thing could create a corpse, could arrange Emma's remains in a way that told a story his supervisors would accept. Animal attack, probably. Evidence of a cougar kill, properly staged, enough left behind for identification, nothing to suggest impossible physics or transformative entities. No, Daniel said, the word surprising him again. No false evidence. Then what will you tell them? That their daughter exists in superposition, half transformed into something your language can't describe? They'll think you suffered a breakdown. They'll remove you from service. Your 23 years of credibility will dissolve, and they'll send others to search. Others I might not be so patient with. The threat was clear but delivered without malice. A simple statement of fact. Daniel had been given privileged information because he demonstrated the capacity to receive it. Others might not be so fortunate. Give me one night, he heard himself say. Let me think. Let me understand what I'm dealing with before I decide what to report. Silence. The clearing held its breath. Daniel realized he was negotiating with something that existed outside his paradigm of reality, trying to apply human concepts of time and decision-making to an entity that apparently experienced consciousness non-linearly. One night, the voice agreed, now coming from a single direction. The shrine itself, specifically from the Polaroid still lying face up on the stones. But don't stray far, Daniel Kowalski. The change has already started in you. You looked too long at the evidence. You saw the impossibility too clearly. Your mind is already trying to exist in multiple spaces, already questioning singular perspective. What do you mean? The fingerprints. When you first saw them, you checked 3 times. Do you remember what you were doing while you checked? Daniel's memory stuttered. He'd examined the tent pole, then walked to the tree, then approached the trail register. Sequential actions, linear time. Except he had a distinct memory of touching all 3 surfaces simultaneously, of his hands reaching out in multiple directions at once, of his consciousness splitting between observation points. It had lasted only a second, maybe less, but the memory was clear. He'd been in 3 places at once. No, that was impossible. He'd checked them one at a time. He was sure of it. Wasn't he? Sleep on it, the voice suggested, withdrawing now, the presence thinning. In the morning, you'll decide what story to tell, truth or fiction. Either way, something ends tomorrow. The forest sounds returned abruptly. Wind, birds, the distant creek, all rushing back as if someone had unmuted the world. The clearing was just a clearing again. The trees just trees. The shrine just stones and offerings left by hikers who believed in tradition without understanding its weight. Daniel stood alone in the growing darkness, his radio crackling with static, his backup team still hours away, and the impossible evidence spreading like frost through his methodical, rational mind. He should leave. Hike back down to the maintained trail, meet Peterson and Martinez, file a report about an active search requiring additional resources. Standard procedure. Safe procedure. Instead, he found himself pulling emergency gear from his pack, setting up a rudimentary bivvy shelter at the clearing's edge. He ate an energy bar without tasting it, drank filtered water from Thunder Creek without conscious thought. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind circled the central impossibility. Emma Sullivan had encountered something that violated natural law. She'd been transformed, was still being transformed, into something between human and other. And he had documentation. Photographs, audio recordings on his digital voice recorder that he'd been running during the entire investigation. Physical evidence in the form of tracks and marked trees and impossible fingerprints. What would he do with that documentation? The professional answer was clear. File a complete report, include all evidence, let the investigation follow wherever the facts led. That was his duty. That was what his 2 decades of service demanded. But the personal answer was different, because filing that report would mean attaching his name and credibility to claims of shape-shifting entities. It would mean professional suicide, regardless of the evidence. It would mean watching his career end in psychological evaluation and forced retirement. And it would mean sending more people into these mountains, more researchers and rangers and investigators, all looking for rational explanations to an irrational situation. More potential victims for an entity that clearly viewed human consciousness as something malleable, transformable. Prey. Daniel lay in his bivy sack as full darkness settled over the mountains, stars emerging in the narrow gap above the clearing, bright and cold and distant. He tried to sleep. He needed to sleep. His backup team would arrive near dawn, and he needed to have answers ready, a coherent narrative that would either end this investigation or expand it. But sleep felt dangerous now. Sleep felt like vulnerability, like lowering defenses against something that existed in transitional states, in the spaces between waking and dreaming, between conscious and unconscious. So he lay awake, watching the stars rotate overhead, and tried not to think about how his perspective seemed to be expanding, how he seemed to be seeing the clearing from multiple angles at once, how his consciousness appeared to be spreading, thinning, existing in more than one location. Tried not to think about how that felt almost natural now, almost right. The entity had been correct. The change had started. Looking too long at impossible evidence had cracked something fundamental in his perception. He could feel the fracture widening, his singular perspective beginning to blur into plurality. By morning, he would have to choose: resist the transformation and file a report that would end his career while accomplishing nothing, or surrender to the change and understand what Emma had understood, see what she had seen, exist in the spaces between forms. Or the third option, the one that felt simultaneously cowardly and pragmatic: create a false narrative. Stage evidence of a standard wilderness tragedy. Let Emma's family have closure, even if it was based on lies. Protect his career, protect future hikers from unnecessary investigation, and carry the truth alone. That last option had weight. It felt responsible, almost heroic, taking the burden of knowledge so others wouldn't have to, protecting people from a truth that would destroy them. But it also felt wrong, because lies, even protective ones, had a way of spreading, of creating more problems than they solved. And this entity, this thing that wore many shapes and existed in transitional states, it would still be here, in these mountains, waiting for the next curious researcher or unlucky hiker. Daniel's radio crackled with pre-dawn transmission. "Kowalski, this is Peterson. We're at mile marker 3, ETA 90 minutes. Confirm status." His hand moved to the transmit button. In 90 minutes, he would have to provide answers. In 90 minutes, the choice would be made. Status is... He paused, searching for words that wouldn't be lies but wouldn't be truth either. "Complex. Bring all documentation equipment. And Peterson, come in quiet. Don't announce your presence when you reach the clearing." "Copy that. Approaching with caution. Any active threats?" Daniel looked at the shrine, at the Polaroid showing Emma Sullivan smiling with a too-tall figure in the background. Looked at the trees that had held her face, her stretching scream, her transformation. Looked at his own hands, which he could have sworn were in 3 different positions simultaneously. "Threat level uncertain," he said. "We'll brief on arrival." Kowalski out. He stood, packed his bivy gear, and approached the shrine again as dawn light began filtering through the canopy. The Polaroid was gone. In its place, a new photograph. This one showing Daniel himself, standing in the clearing, examining evidence. Except in this photo, his body was translucent, ghostly, and behind him stood multiple copies of himself, each one slightly different, each one existing in a different stage of transformation. On the back, in handwriting that looked uncomfortably like his own, "You're already choosing." Daniel pocketed the photograph. Evidence or hallucination, it was coming with him. When Peterson and Martinez arrived, he would make his decision: truth, fiction, or something between. But looking at that image, at his own face reflected multiple times, at the certainty of transformation already in progress. He suspected the choice had already been made, not by him, not consciously, but by the simple act of following those impossible tracks, of documenting impossible evidence, of looking too long at the space between forms. He'd wanted to find Emma Sullivan. He'd wanted to understand what happened to her. Now he did, and that understanding was changing him, just as it had changed her, just as it would change anyone who looked long enough at the impossible truth. The forest ranger in him, the man who'd spent 23 years maintaining boundaries between wilderness and civilization, between natural and unnatural, between possible and impossible, that man was dissolving. Something else was emerging in his place. Something that could exist in multiple locations, hold multiple perspectives, walk in multiple forms. Something that understood, finally, what the entity had meant when it said Emma was everywhere, because Daniel was starting to be everywhere too. When Peterson and Martinez entered the clearing at 7:43 a.m., they found Daniel Kowalski standing beside an ancient stone shrine, his body perfectly still, his eyes tracking movement they couldn't see. They called out to him. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned to face them, both rangers would later report that something in his expression had changed, that he looked at them with eyes that seemed to see from multiple angles at once, that when he opened his mouth to explain what he'd discovered, his voice came from several directions simultaneously. But that would come later, in reports that would be dismissed as stress reactions, as the effects of altitude and isolation. In that moment, Peterson and Martinez approached carefully, noting the abandoned campsite, the evidence markers Daniel had placed, the shrine with its fresh offerings. "Kowalski, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel smiled. The expression was correct but felt wrong, like a mask worn by something still learning human expressions. "Not a ghost," he said, his voice steady and strange. "Something between." He handed them his documentation, photographs, recordings, notes, evidence of impossible physics and folkloric entities and transformations that shouldn't exist, evidence they would examine and rationalize and ultimately fail to explain. "I'm writing my report," Daniel said. "It'll take time. There's a lot to document. But I can tell you this. Emma Sullivan came to these mountains looking for truth behind folklore. She found it." "Found what?" Daniel looked back at the shrine, at the trees, at the spaces between solid forms, looked with eyes that now saw from multiple perspectives, that understood plurality of existence, that recognized the artificial nature of singular consciousness. "What we've always feared," he said. "What every culture has warned about in their own language. The things that live in transition, the ones that exist between categories, the shapes that walk." He turned back to his colleagues, and for just a moment, just one terrible moment, Peterson and Martinez saw him as he was becoming. Not a single man, but multiple copies, overlapping and diverging, existing in the same space while occupying different forms. Human and animal and something else, all at once, all transitional, all caught in the process of becoming. Then the moment passed. Daniel stood before them as he'd always been, solid, singular, rational. The illusion of unity restored. But they'd seen, and seeing had consequences. By the time they hiked back down Thunder Creek Trail, by the time they filed their reports and submitted documentation and attended debriefings, all three rangers would carry the same change, the same widening perspective, the same slow transformation from singular to plural, from solid to transitional, from human to something between. Emma Sullivan had been first. Daniel Kowalski had been second. Peterson and Martinez made 4 and 5. The entity that had no single name, that existed in the spaces between forms, that had lived in these mountains since before humans had words for their fears. It was patient. It had all the time required. Because every investigation brought more observers, more witnesses, more minds capable of seeing the impossible and being changed by that seeing. The change was spreading, slowly, carefully, one rational mind at a time. And once enough people existed in plurality, once enough consciousness had learned to occupy multiple perspectives simultaneously, the boundary between human and other would dissolve completely. That was the truth Emma Sullivan had discovered. That was what she'd wanted to understand. And now Daniel understood it too, with a clarity that erased everything he'd believed about discrete boundaries and singular existence. He filed his report 3 weeks later. It was thorough, professional, and contained no mention of impossible physics or folkloric entities or consciousness existing in multiple states simultaneously. It described Emma Sullivan's disappearance as a probable animal attack, with insufficient remains recovered for detailed analysis. Case closed pending further evidence. The lie was perfect because it was incomplete rather than false. There had been an attack, though not by an animal anyone would recognize. There were remains, though they existed in forms that exceeded standard definitions of physical matter. The case was closed, though the transformation continued. Daniel Kowalski continued working as a forest ranger for North Cascades National Park. His colleagues noticed small changes, the way he sometimes seemed to look at them from multiple angles, the way his voice occasionally echoed from impossible directions, the way he appeared to be in 2 places at once during routine patrols. But those observations were dismissed, written off as stress, as tricks of light and echo, as the mind filling gaps with familiar patterns. And Daniel continued his work, maintaining trails and rescuing lost hikers and documenting evidence of the natural world. Only now he saw that world from perspectives that included but exceeded human limitations. He walked trails on 2 feet and 4, occupied multiple locations during single patrols, existed in the spaces between official categories. He understood finally what the entity had offered Emma Sullivan. Not death, but expansion. Not destruction, but transformation. The chance to become something larger than singular consciousness allowed. And every now and then, when he stood in that clearing at mile marker 4-7, when he visited the ancient shrine with its stone cairn and fresh offerings, he heard Emma's voice speaking through multiple throats at once, welcoming him to the spaces between, thanking him for following the impossible tracks, for documenting the truth that would eventually spread beyond these mountains. The fingerprints had appeared in 3 locations simultaneously. That had been the beginning. The evidence of plurality, of consciousness existing beyond singular perspective. By the end, Daniel's fingerprints would appear in dozens of locations at once, hundreds eventually. His existence spreading across the wilderness he'd spent his career protecting, becoming part of the boundary between human and other, between singular and plural, between the truth people could accept and the truth that would transform them. The change was slow, subtle, patient, but it was absolute, and it had only just begun. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.